Global. Estados Unidos, el gigante
Global. The United States, the ailing giant, began the year 2026 with a military escalation unprecedented in recent history. In just 15 days, the United States seized 4 new oil tankers in international waters, one of them flying the Russian flag, carried out a military attack against Venezuela that left 100 dead, kidnapped Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, began preparations for the capture of Greenland, launched a military mobilization for an imminent airstrike against Iran, and also withdrew from 66 international treaties and organizations. All of this in just 15 days.
Todo esto en apenas 15 días. Frente a esta escalada,
In the face of this escalation, against everything and everyone, Russia responded with a show of force by launching the Oreshnik hypersonic missile. The United States, however, will not abandon its course of unrestrained imperial action. In this context, we shouldn't be asking whether a great global war will begin, but rather when that terrible war will start. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from Berlin, Germany. We begin broadcast number 322 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and remember to give us a thumbs up, naturally, against censorship. From Madrid, Spain, we're joined by our dear Juan Antonio Aguilar. Juan Antonio, how are things over there?
Juan Antonio Aguilar. Juan Antonio, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
How are you? Very good, Ezequiel. A pleasure, as always, to be here, and greetings to all the viewers.
Juan Antonio, 15 días, 16 días del año 2020.
Juan Antonio, 15 days, 16 days into the year 2026, and we are witnessing truly unprecedented events in recent history. Everyone will remember the latest escalation, at least those who follow the channel. We saw it just days ago, when the United States seemed on the verge of launching an airstrike against Iran. In the end, at the last moment, it reversed course and delayed that attack, which to me still seems imminent. But beyond that, the United States is clearly pursuing an undeniable and uninterrupted military course from now on. Greenland also appears to be one of its imminent targets. And in this context, Juan Antonio, we are approaching an escalation, and from that escalation, the beginning of a direct global war between the great powers, with the always latent possibility of a nuclear escalation as well.
Well, from the moment a hegemonic power is confronted by emerging powers, we already know there's a risk of a global confrontation. It's what's commonly called the Thucydides trap. And I very much fear that the U.S. administration, I won't go into the adjectives I think apply to the people there. You all know them already. That is, the U.S. administration, I believe, has started a race against the clock, possibly because its external achievements aren't very good, beyond kidnapping a head of state, which is absolutely pathetic. That is, staging the operation they did simply to kidnap President Nicolás Maduro. We'll talk about that later because it's Venezuela, right? But it feels like there's really a race against time. The imminent aggression against Iran, the issue of the occupation or purchase or whatever you want to call it of Greenland. Why such a rush, all this happening in just a few days? Why such a rush? Because there are more factors. Right? There are more factors. We could talk about how the U.S. economy continues to evolve globally, how the debt keeps growing, how the process of outsourcing continues. So there's a rush to try to find solutions that can stop that process of decline. And there's a rush because in 9 months there will be an election campaign, midterm elections, where I very much fear that, among other things, and perhaps mainly because of the internal situation in the United States, not only the economic one, but also the social one, as we've all been seeing these days with the protests, it's quite possible that Donald Trump will lose the elections. And if Donald Trump loses the elections, he will lose control of Congress, of the House of Representatives, and he will lose control of the Senate. and he'll become a lame duck president, spending all day insulting everyone because they won't let him do what he wants to do. And I think he's aware, and the clique around him is also aware, that this regime has 9 months left to do things their way. We shouldn't fool ourselves. That is, no matter how much the majorities in Congress change, and even if there were presidential elections tomorrow, and they replaced Donald Trump, for example, if he lost Congress and there were an impeachment, they could remove Donald Trump from the picture. But even if that happened, the imperialist, neo-colonialist, aggressive, and exploitative plans for the world would continue. Because the reason is geopolitical and goes beyond that. What's at stake is global hegemony. What may change are the methods.
Lo que pasa es que pueden cambiar las formas, ¿no? Porque yo no sé si es muy inteligente el camino que ha tomado la.
Because I don't know if the path the U.S. administration has taken is a very smart one. In the end, well, it has created a sense of antipathy and deep disgust among a large part of the population of the Americas. It has created a situation of internal polarization within its own country, which is expressed daily in street protests, some of them already turning violent. It has escalated confrontation with the Eurasian powers, China, Iran, Russia, and on top of that, it has clashed with the Europeans. I really don't know what's left. Maybe next it'll pick a fight with the Australians, with the penguins in Antarctica, who knows. Opening all these fronts at once is making a mistake that has always led to the collapse of empires. Overextension.
Overextension.
Overextension, indeed. Overextension, and therefore trying to deal with everything at once. Well, maybe the United States can't do that anymore. At one point, perhaps they could. At the end of World War II, they were the only nuclear power in existence. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there were no emerging powers capable of challenging them. But that's no longer the case, and what we've seen with the imminent attack on Iran is proof that it's no longer the case. Maybe, in some way, dazzled, so to speak, by the operation in Venezuela, they think they can do the same thing anywhere. And I imagine that at the Oval Office table, when the Pentagon and intelligence reports on the plan to attack Iran were presented, things must have looked much tougher than Mr. Trump expected. And to put it bluntly, he got scared of launching the attack and decided it was better to wait for another time. And now, if you'd like, we can start breaking things down, right?
All right. Here, by the way, are images of the situation in Minneapolis, still out of control. Clashes between federal forces and all kinds of protesters, from people active in political organizations to ordinary citizens who oppose this. The mayor of Minneapolis rejects the federal intervention. The local police forces are supposedly against it, which also brings up the threat of a federal intervention. But anyway, beyond this situation, yes, let's see.
They're threatening to deploy the army against the citizens.
Indeed. In Iran, to begin with, Juan Antonio, what was behind this last-minute retreat, this hesitation, this fear from Trump in the face of a possible Iranian response? Or was it due to Israel's apparent last-minute request not to start the attack? Or to the fact that a good part of his military forces are still in the Caribbean? What's your interpretation of this?
¿Cuál es tu interpretación de esto?
Bueno, vamos a hacer un análisis estratégico.
Well, let's do a strategic analysis and a tactical analysis. Just one initial comment. The protests taking place within American society are not new. It's not just because of the crime committed the other day against a young woman. The American police shot her 3 times inside her car. These protests have been happening since the genocide in Gaza began. Remember, in universities, in the streets, they've tried to disrupt meetings, conferences of senators, of congresspeople. We've already had many months of protests in the streets. If this keeps intensifying, Donald Trump and his entourage will head into the next elections, facing a really bad situation domestically.
Mala a nivel interno. Respecto al tema de Irán, vamos a ver.
Regarding the issue of Iran, let's see. What has happened? What has happened is a strategic paralysis that the U.S. administration has brought upon itself. What is their intervention model? The same as always, the air-land battle. In other words, a model of short, precise warfare aimed at decapitating the leadership of the enemy country, inflicting unbearable damage that, along with destabilization methods, could lead to a coup, a regime collapse, the fall of the Iranian government, and so on. That's the plan they have. But of course, the short, surgical war and all that face serious difficulties because Iran has the capacity to respond.
Porque Irán tiene capacidad de responder. Primero, porque ha sabido.
First, because it has managed to eliminate the internal threat. That is, the whole plan that begins with economic strangulation, media warfare, bringing out an unpresentable figure as the head of the Iranian opposition, the son of the criminal Shah of Persia. Things that have no internal traction whatsoever, arming, financing, and organizing terrorist groups, armed gangs, and the like, whether Kurdish, Azeri, ISIS, or groups like the Mek, right? To provoke internal uprisings with casualties, with snipers shooting at security forces and even at the protesters themselves. There is talk of around 680 victims. Most of them are neither armed protesters nor members of such terrorist groups. They have been either civilians or security agents. They are the main victims.
Son los que han sido las principales víctimas, por supuesto con decapitaciones al estilo ISIS, porque eran del ISIS.
Of course, with ISIS-style beheadings, because they were from ISIS. Armed Kurdish groups infiltrated from Iraq. The Iranian leadership has managed to respond and block this internal coup, this internal destabilization, and after that failure comes the moment for an external military intervention. It should be said that the other night, when everyone was expecting that military intervention, Iran had already been calm for 3 days. In fact, there had been massive pro-government demonstrations across the country, with rallies and marches that brought together more than 8 million people in Tehran alone, near 2 images that most of those watching us have probably not seen in the corporate media market because they have been hidden.
This tells you about yesterday morning. Absolute peace in the streets.
Es así, entonces, claro.
That's right. So, of course, the moment comes to launch the attack. One might think, well, they didn't have all the necessary forces gathered. In the area? Well, that depends on what kind of attack they want to carry out. I mean, here's where the options come in. Let's see. What are the American military options when it comes to launching that attack against Iran? Option 1, total war. That is, starting a campaign that would last for months, with bombers and the subsequent landing or attack by ground units to occupy the country and so on. Well, this comes with human, financial, and political costs that the United States simply cannot afford right now. Especially, as I said, 10 months before an election, when a large part of its forces are not in the theater of operations, but in the Caribbean or the Asia-Pacific.
O están en el Caribe o están en el Asia-Pacífico. Con lo cual, es decir, esa sobreextensión imperial.
Which means that this imperial overextension prevents them from concentrating all the necessary force at a specific point, and therefore makes a large-scale military operation useless. So what's left then? The surgical bombing strike, as we've said. But of course, now without the possibility of simultaneously carrying out, as they tried in the 12-day war, an uprising or coup d'etat or something similar, to make the regime collapse. What can they do now? A strike, if they can bomb. And what's the political goal of that? Can they kill? Kill, yes. That's what they do best, kill. But beyond that, what are they going to achieve? What's the purpose of the attack? If the attempt at a Maidan-style coup, like in Ukraine in 2014, which they had already planned, has failed, then what's the point of the bombing?
El bombardeo, ¿qué sentido tiene? ¿Cuál es el objetivo? Es más,
What's the objective? In fact, the only thing that could happen is that it opens the door to an uncontrollable escalation. And, for example, that could lead to the bombing of American bases in the area, bombings in Israel, problems in the Strait of Hormuz, or even the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Oil prices could rise, I don't know, by $30 or $40 per barrel. That would mean an economic crisis, higher prices for goods, of course, since everything becomes more expensive due to fuel costs, which would lead to higher inflation in the United States itself, making it impossible to lower interest rates. And Trump would find himself in a troublesome economic situation in the coming months. So, what's the objective? And this must have weighed on the decision the other day not to launch the operation. And why do I call it strategic paralysis?
¿Y por qué digo lo de la parálisis estratégica? Porque efectivamente, ¿qué otra opción tiene? ¿Qué otra opción?
Because indeed, what other option does it have? What other option does it have? What is Iran's central strategy? Well, that any U.S. tactical gain turns into a strategic loss by raising the cost of the conflict to an unbearable level. As I said, causing, well, economic problems through the issue of oil and so on, right? Then on top of that, there was no support from countries in the region. Saudi Arabia denies airspace, Qatar opposes, Turkey helps Iran by providing intelligence information. Let's remember, as a NATO member, why?
¿Por qué? Porque lo que menos le interesa es que pueda balcanizarse Irán y los kurdos.
Because what interests them least is the possibility of Iran becoming Balkanized and the Kurds gaining another territory from which to attack Turkey. It all makes sense. This has to be put on the table when planning a military campaign. Conclusion. Deep down, what this has shown is strategic weakness. In other words, they weren't prepared. There's no plan B. Because, ultimately, what is the strategic goal that the United States and Israel have with their harassment of Iran? Regime change? There's no other. That's the strategic goal, to change the regime. Wyckoff and that whole bunch of disreputable people talk about issues like the nuclear program. The nuclear program had already been agreed upon, and it was Donald Trump who withdrew from the deal.
Ya estaba pactado y Donald Trump fue quien se retiró del pacto. Que si la misilística, hombre, claro, tú quieres que Irán se desarme.
About the missile program. Of course, you want Iran to disarm so that later, once it has disarmed, then you can attack it, right? But who's going to trust you? Let's be honest. If the West, and even more so the Anglo-Zionists, don't respect a single treaty, not one, who's going to trust you? No one can. Because you'll stab them in the back, because that's how you are by nature, treacherous, aggressive, otherwise, not a word. So no one's going to trust you. How could Iran trust you? How could it give up its missile program if that's its only defense? So these things are absurd. That is, Netanyahu called Trump on the phone to tell him, no, now is not the time to attack. Lie. That's a lie. This was put out by the New York Times, as always, an Anglo-Zionist outlet, claiming that a high-ranking anonymous official said so. In other words, every time one of these publications says, according to leaked information, or according to statements from a high-ranking anonymous official, it's a lie. It's simply information warfare, nothing more. What we're seeing here is damage control. That is, what do we say after everyone was expecting the attack to be launched? What do we say when we couldn't or didn't want to launch it? We need to do some damage control and change the narrative. So the damage control is basically that Trump was supposedly convinced by some people to wait, to not launch the attack. We have to give diplomacy a chance, a lie. Or the excuse, well, they tell me, says Trump, they tell me they've stopped shooting at the protesters and that they're not going to execute the 800 detainees. A lie. Why do you even care about executions? If you preside over a country that carries out executions, that executes people, why would you care about executions? What are you trying to convince us of, Donald? Do you think everyone is as crazy as you are? So fine, what happened? What happened is that the Iranians were ready, because Iran lives as if war were inevitable.
como si la guerra fuera inevitable.
He lives as if war were inevitable, and therefore, at the slightest piece of information from his intelligence services, or simply in response to Trump's bluster, the only thing he does is take action. So he goes ahead and closes all the airspace over Iran and Iraq, leaving open the space needed for a massive missile response against Israel and the American bases in the area. I imagine he clearly knew that Saudi Arabia would not open its airspace to the Anglo-Zionist forces. He knows he won't have problems with Turkey, Qatar, and the others. And so, let's say he has the territory prepared for the response. In addition, he orders all air defenses to shoot down any unidentified flight. Whatever it is, let it be taken down. And in addition, they deploy their MiG-29 aircraft, which are already not modern, but they serve one fundamental purpose: the detection and interception of targets, that in the event of a communications failure, allow the entire Iranian defense system to have the information needed to identify, detect the attack, and initiate a response. And those planes were in Iranian and Iraqi airspace for hours. So, well, acting as if war were inevitable, and keeping in mind that the goal is not to intercept every attack, because that's impossible, the strategy was to absorb them and increase the cost for the enemy, thus maintaining offensive flexibility.
Una flexibilidad ofensiva. Y de esta forma, pues, yo creo.
And in this way, well, I believe that the analysts at the Pentagon and the U.S. intelligence services informed Trump that it couldn't be guaranteed, those were Trump's first words, that any strike carried out would achieve the strategic objectives. And this needs to be emphasized again, because there are plenty of fools commenting in groups, forums, and so on, saying things that are honestly exhausting to repeat and explain 1,000 times, and they'll never get it, because someone who's mentally stuck just won't accept reality. A military campaign is victorious when it achieves its strategic objective. If not, it doesn't matter. You can destroy a lot. You can shoot down all the enemy planes.
Puedes derribar todos los aviones enemigos. Puedes destruir sus centros de comando y control.
You can destroy their command and control centers. You can do whatever you want. Fill the country with bombs. If you don't achieve the strategic objective, the military campaign is a failure. And it's a strategic failure. Even if you have a tactical victory, it's a strategic failure. And this is what we've seen in Iran. I know there are many people who don't want to accept it because they've turned into a kind of fried brain, where everything Trump says and does is wonderful, because there's a certain tendency among humans to follow all the mentally ill people in the world, and Trump is a madman. Well, fine, go ahead, keep seeing things that way. But what military science says is that if you plan a campaign with a specific objective or set of strategic objectives and end the campaign without achieving them, you have failed. You've lost. It's that simple. You've lost. That's how it stands. I imagine it won't stay that way, because between Trump's frustrated ego as a proper madman and the North American imperialist and colonialist interests, they'll try again. Well, and besides all that, the genocidal Netanyahu and company who want to keep attacking Iran, of course they'll try again. There's no doubt they'll try again. That is, they'll build up more forces, bring in planes from who knows where, some aircraft carrier from who knows which country. In other words, they'll amass power there to try to launch an attack. But what kind of attack? I'll say it again, a full-scale war? They can't. An air-ground battle? For what purpose? Do they think that by bombing they'll change the Iranian regime? Do they think that by destroying certain weapons systems, when Russian and Chinese cargo planes keep landing at Tehran airport with military supplies, they'll suffocate them? I mean, the Russian Tobol system is the one that's been used to block Starlink, which I remind you is a satellite signal.
Que es una señal satelital, lo recuerdo. Es decir, que se pueden bloquear las señales satelitales.
That is to say, satellite signals can be blocked. So how are the American missiles going to be guided toward their targets at a time when perhaps with GPS interference, which of course Iran suppressed the other night, how will they be able to navigate? No, they'll have to be guided by what's already built into the missile's own program, because they may not have satellite guidance or a GPS signal. And that might work, perhaps, to strike a base you've already located and maybe destroy some barracks there, but not the missile launchers, which are mobile and have already moved. And possibly, I don't know how the Iranian army will handle it, but maybe they're changing positions every half hour. So, how are you going to do it? What are you going to achieve? I mean, sure, they might use some secret weapon, like in Venezuela, a sonic weapon used by riot police. Then they think that with that, maybe they can conquer all of Iran and part of Central Asia. But anyway, setting aside the Hollywood and Netflix nonsense, which they usually use to fool people into believing they're invincible, what we've actually seen is damage control and a narrative shift to cover up a failure.
Juan Antonio, tres preguntas sobre Irán.
Juan Antonio, 3 questions about Iran, partly answered already, but I'd like a bit more of your perspective on this. First, this time around, does Iran seem better prepared than before the 12-day war? Will Iran be less taken by surprise this time than it was back then? That's the first question. Second question, beyond this last-minute correction, will Trump still launch an attack against Iran soon? Remembering above all that last time, before the treacherous attack from behind, during the day of the 6th round of negotiations, if I recall correctly, one day it seemed like yes, another day like no, and finally, behind all those deceptions, Israel carried out the attack with the support of the United States. And a third question. In the event that an attack actually begins and Iran eventually responds against Israel, because Israel is going to take part in this, could Israel find itself cornered if Iran responds as it did in the 12-day war, but with even greater missile power? Because let's remember that in the last confrontation, although it carried out powerful missile attacks, it did not strike Israel with the most modern and powerful parts of its arsenal, for various reasons. In this situation, could Israel, feeling cornered, deliberate over the so-called Samson option and respond with nuclear force? Or would logic and reason somehow impose an unbreakable limit on Netanyahu and his clique of lunatics? Those are the 3 questions, Juan Antonio. A better prepared Iran, the inevitable start of an attack, and the possibility of nuclear escalation.
Empiezo por la segunda. Ataque sí o sí, algo tiene que hacer Trump.
I'll start with the second point. An attack, no matter what, Trump has to do something. Because look, right now we're still dealing with what happened the other night and all that. But the time for analysis will come. And this won't go unnoticed by many analysts, including American ones, who will say, well, we made fools of ourselves. So Trump will have to do something to counter that situation. Possibly a bombing, launching 60 or 70 Tomahawk missiles. We already know that 35% will hit the target, so that Trump can say, we've destroyed all of Iran's missile and nuclear capability for the next 200 or 300 years, which is what he said last time. In other words, look at how things stand. Among the points Huico says should be negotiated with Iran is the delivery of 1,200 kilograms of enriched uranium.
De 1.200 kilogramos de uranio enriquecido. Pero no lo habían destruido todo.
But they hadn't destroyed everything. They hadn't destroyed it. In fact, they themselves admit that it was another failure. They only bombed the entrances to the silos. That is, when the Iranians reopened them over the following week, that was it. The silos were open again. What are they going to do now? The same thing. They can do the same thing, and Trump will say he's destroyed everything, that Iran won't recover for 6 or 7 centuries. Well, yes, he'll have to do something like that, because somehow he has to counter not a narrative but an objective reality that any analyst can see. And that is that the other day he had to abort an operation because there was a high risk it would go very badly. Very badly. And that's a failure.
Muy mal. Y eso es un fracaso. Eso es como si usted pone un grupo de ejércitos para iniciar la...
That's like deploying an army group to launch the offensive that will lead to victory, and then, half an hour before giving the order to advance, aborting the operation when everything is already in motion. That's honestly horrifying. From a military standpoint, a disaster. Because on top of that, there's no element of surprise here. There's not going to be any internal instability anymore. Can they decapitate someone? Yes. And what do they think? That the Iranians aren't capable of reestablishing a chain of command within a few hours, knowing that some of their military and political leaders might be killed or affected? Who do they think they're dealing with? Now then, let me go to the first question. Are they better prepared? Of course they're better prepared. And they've perfected and developed new missiles, some with intercontinental capability.
Alguno con capacidad intercontinental. Ojo, Irán tiene satélites en órbita.
Careful. Iran has satellites in orbit. In fact, less than 10 days ago, they put 3 new satellites into orbit, launched from Baikonur in Russian territory, using a Russian spacecraft and rocket. Of course, they're better prepared, and they also have stronger ties through their strategic agreement with China and Russia. And if they're not even better prepared yet, it's the Iranians' own fault, because they've had time to finalize an agreement with Russia and China, like the one Russia has with Belarus or North Korea. But, well, they won't tell you that.
Es decir, pero vamos, esto no solo Irán. Todos los países de la Organización de Cooperación de Shanghái,
all the countries of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization at this moment should be building a military alliance to confront a crazy, deranged guerrilla in the White House, surrounded by a gang of criminals. Because we're not just seeing it in Iran. We could say, well, it's a particular obsession, it's about defending Israel. No, we're seeing it in Venezuela and in Greenland. And he's threatening Colombia, Mexico, and Cuba. In fact, at this point, I even think that any moment now, they'll say they're also buying in Iceland to gain control of the passage between the Arctic and the North Atlantic. So when we're dealing with a power like that, one that intends to maintain its hegemony at any cost, where the UN has already become a completely useless structure, international law has turned into a comic book, something to laugh at, where NATO has also become an incapable, divided, and fractured structure, and where there are only 2 or 3 weeks left before the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement expires, without Washington saying a word, even after Russia offered to extend the agreement for another year, while a new one is negotiated. They haven't responded. They haven't responded. So, with that attitude and the treacherous precedents you mentioned, indeed how the previous attack on Iran took place while negotiations were still underway. That is to say, who can trust people like that? Any gang of criminals from the darkest, most sinister slums of New York has more integrity and honesty than these people. So, who's going to trust them? Iran is already taking too long to obtain nuclear weapons, because that's the only thing these people understand, nuclear armament. And in fact, there are unofficial reports that Pakistan, if Iran were attacked with nuclear weapons, would offer it its own nuclear arsenal. Which brings us, and this is to stop, to the third issue you raised, the possibility that, at some point, the Zionist lunatics in Tel Aviv might see no other option than to carry out a nuclear attack on Iran. And then we could find ourselves facing 2 situations. One, that Iran might also respond in a similar and symmetrical way, with a nuclear attack on Israel. That would turn the world upside down. I mean, to me it seems absolutely, I don't even know how to put it. I don't even want to imagine it, because that would turn the world upside down. A nuclear exchange in the Middle East. For the economic crisis, the huge problem for distribution networks, especially energy. So, What can Israel do? Could it start something like that? It could, because it's run by a bunch of lunatics, religious fundamentalists, who believe that with the destruction of the wall would come the reconstruction of the temple and the arrival of the Messiah. With people like that. That is to say, you can expect anything. But I believe that indeed, before a situation like that happens, there will be actors who will put a stop to it, one way or another. But even if Iran never gained access to a nuclear weapon to respond symmetrically, that still wouldn't guarantee anything for Israel either. What do they think? Not to attack with one nuclear weapon, but with the 200 they have? Do they plan to launch 200 nuclear weapons against Iran? I mean, really, can anyone imagine that? And if we can't imagine it, then who are we dealing with? I mean, we have to pay them. We have to pay them.
And the possibility of an attack on the nuclear base, on the Dimona nuclear plant, which would in some way trigger a nuclear attack using conventional weapons.
Yes, no. I mean, logically, they could destroy the Dimona plant. It would cause a situation similar to Chernobyl, maybe with the reactors melting down. I don't know. I mean, you can imagine all sorts of scenarios, each one more catastrophic than the last. That's why I think there has to be some kind of self-restraint here. Because I don't see how this could end in a victory, you know? I mean, no, it's very clear. A clean, surgical, magnificent military operation, straight out of a Hollywood movie, and then it's all done, right? What a huge trap. They should build him another monument. Let's see. Another Nobel Peace Prize. They already have one. Give them another. So I basically think they can only try to carry out an attack that will cause some damage in such a way that they can shape a narrative to say, look how great we are and what we've won. But remember, Trump already won the war against the Yemenis while his fleet was running away. And what did he say? We've won. Well, there you go. There are the Yemenis, there are the Chavistas still in power in Venezuela, Khamenei is still in Iran. So yeah, from victory to victory until the final defeat. I mean, I don't know. That is to say, because in the end, I repeat, and this seems to be what many people have trouble understanding, if you don't achieve the strategic objectives you set for yourself, your military campaign is a failure. That's it. I mean, later they can say, but we destroyed such and such. Fine, okay, see you next time. That's it. When people don't want to see reality, well, fine, that's that. I mean, they can go work for a Western media outlet, and then they can imagine a parallel world like Hollywood or Netflix, and that's that. But this is how things are. And I'm telling you, if Iran doesn't have even more power right now, it's because of the Iranians themselves. That is to say, because they haven't wanted to, well, for whatever reasons, internal politics, or because the faction currently governing Iran is somehow trying to negotiate with the West to see if sanctions can be lifted and things can return to a more normal situation, which is understandable, right? I think that given what we've seen since Donald Trump became president of the United States, the only thing that's happened is the acceleration of a process that was already underway, namely the U.S. attempt to maintain its dominant position in global geopolitics. But it's been accelerated under Trump, and given what we've seen, no one can claim to be deceived. No one can claim to be deceived. It's crucial right now for the Global South to reach military defense agreements to confront these people.
Yesterday, during the talk with Eduardo Villor and Santiago Martinez, who were naturally also asked about this question, Eduardo Villor responded that a nuclear attack by Israel, the Samson option, would lead to Israel's destruction, and that the Israeli armed forces would not endorse mutual destruction. since he described them as genocidal but serious in military terms. Therefore, according to him, the armed forces would set a limit to the madness of launching a nuclear attack from Israel, as that would result not only in Iran's destruction, but also in Israel's. The argument is well-founded, no doubt, but the number of lunatics in the Israeli government sometimes raises doubts, doesn't it?
Generan dudas a veces, ¿no?
Sí, no, aparte de que la doctrina Samson es mucho más siniestra.
Yes, besides the fact that the Samson option is much more sinister than it seems, because it's not about launching a nuclear attack against Iran. If somehow that could be seen as leading to victory, I have no doubt that Israel would launch a nuclear attack. I mean, for people who are genocidal, they couldn't care less about launching a nuclear attack. No, the Samson option is much worse. In the face of Israel's disappearance, in the face of a defeat that would put the very existence of the State of Israel at risk, the Samson doctrine says that this would also be the responsibility of those allies who were unable to defend Israel. And it would also mean a nuclear attack against them. In other words, complete madness. Total madness. Of course, I understand that an Israeli general who has gone through staff college, who has studied or shared studies with American or British generals, I suppose would have a greater degree of rationality to realize that what's being proposed is sheer lunacy. I mean, it's like elements of the Islamic State, Jewish version. The difference is that some have knives to slit throats and the others have nuclear weapons. But the mentality is the same mentality.
La mentalidad es la misma mentalidad. Es decir, entonces, claro.
So, of course, given the nature of the Israeli leadership, one can expect anything. But I imagine there must be some rational actors out there. I want to believe, though I might be wrong, but I want to believe there will be rational actors out there who prevent such an outcome. And besides, that kind of outcome will become increasingly unlikely as I said, the Global South finally decides to converge and start forming military alliances, building economies of scale in defense spending, standardizing their defense systems, and turning the Eurasian continent into a true fortress.
Y hacer del continente euroasiático una auténtica fortaleza. Y entonces, ante eso, imagina por un momento que hubiera...
And so, faced with that, imagine for a moment that there were a fifth article that forced Russia, China, even India or Pakistan, that compelled them to immediately come to Tehran's aid in the event of an Anglo-Zionist attack. Well, what would they do? What would they do? We'd be heading for a world war. That's what they want. We'd be heading for a world war. I think that given the prospect of mutually assured destruction, if for 60 years, well, 40-some years, it has worked to prevent a nuclear war, it has worked to end everything without a Holocaust, then I imagine it can still work at the moment when, of course, real red lines are drawn for Trump and his imperialist friends.
A Trump y a sus amigos imperialistas.
La última sobre Irán, Juan Antonio.
The latest on Iran, Juan Antonio. According to one line of interpretation, a geopolitical interpretation, the US attack on Iran, or in other words, the possible US attack on Iran, would actually be aimed at disrupting China's oil supply. Let's remember that Iran exports between 80 and 90% of its oil to China, producing between 3 and 3.5 million barrels per day, 3 times, or more than 3 times, what Venezuela produces. So ultimately, this attack would be intended to cut off that flow of oil. Even more so, considering that the Iranians are largely selling this oil to China in yuan, which would also amount to one of the, how should we call it, one of the points of weakening of the dollar on a global scale, something similar to what was supposedly sought in Venezuela. Until recently, Venezuela had a similar situation, 80% of its oil sold to China, the Chinese paying in yuan, and then using those yuan to buy Chinese goods for the everyday life of Venezuelans. How plausible is such a hypothesis, Juan Antonio? Or are we overinterpreting?
Juan Antonio, o estamos realizando
No,
una
no,
sobreinterpretación?
es así, es así. Es decir, lo que pasa es que hablábamos antes del objetivo
That's
estratégico de
right.
la campaña
That's
militar.
right.
Mm.
The thing
Si
is,
hablamos del
we were
objetivo
talking earlier about the
es
strategic
evidente
objective
que
of the
es ese,
military campaign.
porque
If we talk about the
con respecto a
geopolitical
Irán,
objective,
no está
it's
haciendo
clear
una
that
labor
this
de
is it.
expansionismo
Because
que
look,
pueda poner
Iran
en
isn't carrying out any
de los Estados
expansionist
Unidos o de sus
activity
aliados.
that could endanger the
No,
national
es más,
security of the United States or
su
other
rival de
countries.
siempre, que es Arabia
In
Saudita, ha
fact,
llegado a un acuerdo
its
con Irán.
longtime rival, Saudi
No
Arabia,
pretende
has reached an agreement with
expansionarse a
them.
costa de Turquía.
It doesn't intend to expand at the expense of
No
Turkey or
pretende
Azerbaijan.
expansionarse a costa de
It doesn't
Pakistán
intend to
o de
expand at the
Afganistán
expense
o
of
de-
Pakistan or
no,
Afghanistan.
no ha atacado a
It hasn't
Oman,
attacked
ni
Oman or
a
any of the
ninguna de las
petromonarchies.
monarquías.
So,
Irán no es
Iran
un
isn't
solo
considered a
punto
threat to the
peligro
surrounding
para
nations.
las naciones de la
But come on, this can be proven empirically.
Pero
How many
vamos,
countries has Iran invaded since the
empíricamente,
Islamic
¿cuántos
Revolution?
países ha invadido Irán desde la Revolución Islámica, 1979? Es más, sufrió una agresión.
What's
por
more, it
parte de
suffered an
Saddam
attack
Hussein,
from Saddam
amigo
Hussein's
de
Iraq.
Occidente,
A friend of the
recordémoslo,
West. Let's remember
amigo de
that.
Occidente.
A friend of the West. Iran, right?
Irán no.
Therefore, the objective, well, you may like its government or political system more or less. That's a debatable issue. But obviously, no, the problem can't be, no, look, the idea here is to organize an alliance against Iran because it's supposedly a danger to the world. I don't see anything there that threatens U.S. national security. Where's the danger? What's the danger there? Not even those terrorists. Because all those who went to the United States and Europe weren't exactly terrorist groups supported by Iran. On the contrary, they were supported by Iran's enemies.
Todo lo contrario. Eran amparados por los enemigos de Irán. Desde las Torres Gemelas hasta lo que usted quiera.
From the Twin Towers to whatever you want. So no. That is to say, now then, there is a geopolitical objective. And the geopolitical objective is China. That is, the first geopolitical goal is to try to make things difficult for China regarding its energy supply. In Venezuela, it was a small amount, we have to admit. I think it was about 4% of the oil China purchased, a lot for the Venezuelans, but little for China. But Iran, yes, Iran is a major oil supplier to China. And so, of course, the idea is to create problems so that China doesn't have access to those energy resources, and at the same time, to prevent the dollar from continuing to fall, from becoming less and less important when it comes to paying international trade bills, particularly for energy. Because if payments aren't made in dollars, then dollars aren't bought, and therefore the dollar loses strength.
Por lo tanto, el dólar pierde poderío. Y eso es muy grave, muy grave.
And that's very serious, because if until now the United States has been paying the interest, not even the debt itself, just the interest on the debt, it was because the dollar was there and necessary for transactions, for international payments. If more and more countries start using their national currencies, or the yuan or any other currency, or gold, the dollar loses capacity, loses power. If it loses power, that means fewer and fewer countries need dollars to make payments. If you don't need dollars, you don't buy dollars. If you don't buy dollars, the dollar doesn't earn from that. The money doesn't come in. If the money doesn't come in, how are you going to pay the interest on the debt? And so there we have it. That is, the United States wants to confront that first-order geopolitical problem. That's why, indeed, both the situation in Venezuela and in Iran have that geopolitical objective. Now, for the same reason, China knows perfectly well how important it is that Iran doesn't fall. And well, the Chinese are the way they are. They're not going to shout it from the rooftops like Donald Trump does every time someone puts a microphone in front of him there on the steps of Air Force One. But the Chinese will act, and they'll act more and more. And the more the United States tries to pressure China to mess with it, the more the Chinese will act. And there will come a time, as I said, when there will be no choice but to move toward that military convergence of the countries of the global south and the emerging powers, simply in self-defense against the gang of lunatics in Washington.
Realicemos un salto hacia
Let's jump let's make a leap to Greenland before presenting the Venezuelan scenario. Here we see yesterday's images with the arrival of the Danish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Greenland, one of the constituent nations of the Kingdom of Denmark. This lady we see here. Both were quite nervous in the moments beforehand. They held a meeting in Washington with Marco Rubio and, if I remember correctly, with Pete Hegseth as well, although it's possible Pete Hegseth didn't take part, and I'm remembering that wrong. As they left, they made statements on the matter.
It is not a true narrative.
That story about us having Chinese warplanes everywhere isn't real. According to our intelligence, there hasn't been a Chinese warplane in Greenland for a decade.
In Greenland for a decade or...
Bien, estas partes de sus palabras y en otro momento...
Well, these are parts of his words. At another time, someone here described the meeting as a failure because, according to this Mr. Lars Løkke, the United States did not give up its desire to annex Greenland. And here are today's statements from the lady who accompanied this gentleman, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Greenland itself, hence her Inuit features. This happened today in an interview with a Greenlandic media outlet.
Attention. Well, the lady practically appears to be crying over the imminent capture of Greenland.
La inminente captura de Groenlandia. De aquí mis preguntas, Juan Antonio.
Hence my questions, Juan Antonio. How plausible is this, the capture of Greenland by the United States? And what would be the consequences for the European Union, for NATO, for the free world? We're about to witness a dreadful spectacle.
We're going to present it. We're going to present it. Let's see, look, I think we've already talked about this before, even with you, Ezequiel. Greenland is lost, but the damage is done. And I feel sorry for that poor woman who appears crying, because it's the cry of despair, of knowing there's nothing to be done, that it's lost. It's lost because, well, Trump is going to try it in a soft way, so to speak. He's going to appeal, he's going to bribe 2 or 3 Greenlandic politicians. Very typical of bribery, among criminals, of course, to appeal to the right to self-determination. The right to self-determination that is recognized in Greenlandic law and has been recognized by Danish law since 2009, I believe.
Desde el año 2009, creo. No, si me equivoco del año, disculpar.
If I'm wrong about the year, my apologies. I think it's 2009. The right to self-determination is recognized. So it would be enough to bribe these guys to request a self-determination referendum for Greenland. Trump would win that referendum because he'd put a check on the table for the Greenlandic citizen to accept, and therefore it wouldn't be necessary for all 50-some thousand, 57,000, I think it is, to agree. No, with 30,000, he'd already have the majority. And it would indeed come out that Greenland wants independence. And once it's independent, it would just be a matter of making a deal for incorporation as the 51st state of the Union or a free associated state treaty like Puerto Rico, and you'd fall under Washington's control. Period. It was known. But even if the Greenlanders said no, 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 even if they were offered a check right on the table, the American Plan B is very simple, to take it militarily. Faced with these two options, what is the first responsibility of the Kingdom of Denmark? What are we going to say here? What are we going to say? What Denmark has done is very regrettable, truly pathetic. So bold against Russia over the issue of Ukraine, and yet cowards, cosmic cowards, when it comes to standing up to the United States. Giving everything you had from your army, small but your army, to Ukraine, to defend the corrupt Zelensky and his whole clique. And now you have nothing to send to Greenland. Nothing at all to send. And on top of that, today I have to hear that your military command is inviting the U.S. Army to military exercises in Greenland. Can there be less dignity? Can you sink any lower? Can you fall any lower? Yes, the European Union can fall even lower. And now let's move on to the next point. The European Union and Denmark as a NATO country, NATO itself. What is NATO going to do? Apply Article 5 if U.S. troops enter Greenland. Is it going to apply Article 5 against the United States, which makes up 70% of NATO? Of course not. It's absurd. It's ridiculous. But the countries of the European Union, which also have a mutual defense clause in the Union treaties, have all come out, that is, as one to say, we're going to defend Greenland. In fact, the British have sent an officer.
De hecho, los británicos han mandado un oficial, los noruegos 2 soldados, los alemanes 13.
The Norwegians, 2 soldiers, the Germans, 13, Sweden, 2, the Netherlands, 1, France, I think 12 as well, or 14. Altogether, not even a full company. Can you sink any lower? These are the ones who said they were going to send 20,000 troops to Ukraine. These are the ones who said, no, we're going to deploy 500,000 troops on the eastern borders to contain Russia and to defend the European Union's own territory. Because after all, Ukraine is neither a NATO member nor a member of the European Union. To defend Greenland, which is EU territory, they send 2 platoons. This is the real capacity of the European Union and NATO. That's what it was. So is this really necessary? We need NATO, or we dissolve it once and for all. We dissolve it once and for all. Of course, Trump will come along and write the check, and the European Union can't write the check. I don't know. Maybe we need a media campaign and to put in some money too. Oh no, that's right. We've spent 200 billion euros helping the green clown from Kiev, his clique, so they can keep snorting whatever they want. No, that's it. So what happens? Will my money disappear? I don't know. Maybe, look, by freezing Russian funds, you'll have some money. Can we sink any lower? We can't sink any lower. It's impossible to sink any lower because yes, things can be done. Of course things can be done. I don't know if at this point Greenland could be saved. Maybe not. That is to say, the American troops arrive there and, well, it's an occupied territory, internationally occupied, and it should be recognized as such at the United Nations, that the United States has illegally occupied the territory of Greenland. But in response to that, of course, things can be done. For example, not buying American products in Europe. For example, selling the American debt held by the European Central Bank and European banks. For example, calling Washington and telling them to start withdrawing all their damn military bases from Europe. In other words, they don't have the guts to do what needs to be done. Of course. Because deep down, the European political class, both in Brussels and in each of our countries' governments, is a colonial, traitorous, sellout political class, serving the North American and pro-British oligarchic power. That's why there's no real analysis being done. But how can it be done? Of course, things can be done. You can even open talks with China and Russia to acquire military equipment, to try to resolve conflict hotspots and focus on defending the sovereign territories of the European Union. Of course, things can be done. But for that, you need courage and not be cowards. For that, you need dignity and not be spineless. I don't want to say more out of respect for the viewers. And then, well, Greenland. It's going to go from being a natural paradise, which is what it is now, to something else. What do you think? The Greenlanders are stupid and don't know they have potential in hydrocarbons, critical materials, rare metals, and so on, all essential for the tech economy. What do you think? That they don't know. Of course they know. But there's a law that says they can't be exploited because they want to preserve their culture, their identity, and their ecosystem as they've had them until now, without bands of pirates flying the Stars and Stripes, the cartel of the Stars and Stripes, coming in to exploit their resources, taking them away in exchange for trinkets and a check for $30, $40, or $100,000. They want to keep dedicating themselves to fishing and to what they've always traditionally done, the Inuit. Not to have Trump and his gang of tech buddies, that whole bunch of crooks, come in to set up artificial intelligence data centers just because they save energy thanks to the low temperatures. Of course.
Claro. Y entonces montar esos centros de datos para que ellos sigan.
And so setting up those data centers so they can keep exploiting resources, keep making money. I mean, it turns out these foolish Inuit don't want to. They don't want to. Where are we going to go? Where will it end? That a few Eskimos don't want to. They're going to hinder development. And besides, there's also an aspect here that shows us the colonialist, predatory nature of the White House, of the U.S. administration. Because if it were about national security, the United States has never had any problem deploying military assets in Greenland. It had no problem during World War II or during the Cold War. In fact, there were about 32 bases. They dismantled them all because when the Cold War ended, it no longer made any sense, and they only kept one, Thule.
Y solo dejaron una, la de Pitufit. Pero es que incluso podrían negociar.
But they could even negotiate for some natural resources to be exploited by American companies. Denmark wouldn't have much trouble agreeing to that either. But no, that's not what they want. They want ownership. They want ownership of the island. They want to keep it. Trump said it in those words. They want the title deed. They want to steal it from Denmark. And they don't care about the people living there. And if they cause too much trouble, they'll be kicked out. There aren't that many of them anyway. If they're capable of carrying out an ethnic cleansing in Gaza with more than 2 million Palestinians, just imagine what 57,000 Inuit can endure. In other words, it's an atrocity built on the colonialist and predatory spirit of the U.S. administration and the utter disgrace of the European political class.
Y la indignidad más absoluta de la clase política europea. En fin.
Anyway, it's going to be very sad. You said it was going to be like something out of Dante, right? That's how it's going to be. Dantean.
Dantesco.
From the dignity of that Inuit official's tears in the face of the inevitable capture of her land, to the indignity of this character, who, besides being undignified, is clownish. So Flomeno brings a smile to my face. Yesterday he delivered a harangue before the French armed forces, in which he presented France as ready for action in defense of NATO, an obvious reference to the possibility of a US advance in Greenland. The funniest part of all this, of this military pep talk, is that Macron showed up with a black eye. In Argentina we call it an eye in compote, almost certainly the result of a slap from Brigitte. It was so obvious that he even had to begin his speech by saying, "Ah, yes, my eye looks red because of a domestic accident." Behind him stood a bleary-eyed man, recently defeated by the Chinese. Well, the soldiers' faces there said it all, didn't they? A perfect reflection of what this man inspires, just as a curious detail.
Eso es que, mira, es decir, la Biblia norteamericana utiliza la mentira por sistema, ¿no?
That is, the American Bible uses lies systematically, right? I mean, the mind is a compulsive liar. And while they say no, it's that Greenland is surrounded by Chinese and Russian ships. Where? Have you seen any photos of Chinese and Russian ships surrounding Greenland? Where? They lie shamelessly. And against that, what stands in opposition? A bunch of people whose only weapons are words. Empty talk. Empty talk. The European military doctrine is to pretend with words and images to be what one is not. Let's see, it's very simple for Macron. If he truly believes what he's saying, what is France still doing in NATO? He's already late in leaving. He should do it tomorrow. And he's already late in offering the authorities of Greenland, "Hey, what do you need? 20,000 troops, 30,000 French army troops? Rafales with nuclear weapons, because France has nuclear weapons. And besides, it's autonomous. It doesn't need encrypted codes like the British do. Come on, let the French armed forces be ready to defend Greenland."
y el yanqui sepa que, oye, a ver si al loco francés
And let the Yankee know that, hey, let's see if this crazy French guy gets the idea. We attack him and he launches a nuclear missile at us. I don't know, maybe at the East Coast, since it's not that far from Greenland. Right? No, of course not. Words, 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 parola, parola, parola. In other words, the same old story. You really can't be more disgraceful. It's truly shameful, honestly, shameful. That said, I also remind you, my dear compatriots across Europe, that these people are there because we voted for them. Right? Remember that. They're there because we voted for them. The tears of the Inuit fall upon the conscience of all of us who voted for this whole bunch of scoundrels. Keep that in mind when you all look at yourselves in the mirror.
Tenganlo en cuenta cuando se miren todos al espejo. Que es que Macron no aterrizó.
Macron didn't land in a flying saucer. He didn't just show up there, no. He's there because people voted for him. He's there because people voted for him. And he's there because he's being kept there. He's being kept there. That French National Assembly, right now, where Macron has an absolute minority, what is it doing? Keeping things as they are and taking no action. And I'm talking about France. I could talk about Spain. We could be here for quite a while. There are no armies in European countries. There are patriotic soldiers, but no armies. They're colonial forces of a foreign power.
Son fuerzas coloniales de una potencia extranjera. Fuerzas coloniales de una potencia extranjera. Por mucho...
Colonial forces of a foreign power. No matter how many braids or medals they wear, no matter how many stars they carry, they are colonial forces serving a foreign power, serving the cartel of the Stars and Stripes. That's also in the oath of all those soldiers, not just the Danish ones. It doesn't include defending our national security or our sovereignty. And when Trump gets Greenland and decides he wants to control the passage from the Arctic to the North Atlantic, will he think of doing the same with Iceland?
¿Se le ocurre hacer lo mismo con Islandia? Y si se le ocurre, porque se le puede ocurrir, porque está en la...
And if it occurs to them, because it might, since it's part of geopolitics, to completely control the Atlantic, in order to cut off the lines, the distribution networks, the supply routes for products coming from Eurasia, probably from China, toward America, and they decide to say, no, I have to take control to maintain the national security of the United States, the security of the Atlantic, the security of the Western Hemisphere. I have to control the entire Atlantic Ocean, the Azores of Portugal, the Canary Islands of Spain, the Falkland Islands. What? So what then? Do we bring out the Legion's goat, have His Majesty appear in full dress uniform, everyone ready to defend national sovereignty, right? Just like we're going to defend Greenland. It's deeply disgusting, profoundly disgusting.
Da profundo asco. Dan profundo asco.
A propósito de asco, Juan Antonio...
Speaking of disgust, Juan Antonio, let's now jump to the American continent. Speaking of indignity, here are the images of Maria Corina Machado after her meeting in Washington with President Trump. The reporter's question, Miss Maria Corina Machado, did you offer President Trump your Nobel Peace Prize? And here's her response.
President of the United States, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, and I told him
200 years
ago, General Lafayette gave Simón Bolívar a medal bearing the face of George Washington. Bolívar said that from that moment on, he kept that medal for the rest of his life. In fact, when you look at his portraits, you can see the medal there. It was given to him by General Lafayette.
Bueno, esa la comparación histórica entre Washington.
Well, that's the historical comparison between Washington and Bolívar, and Trump, and Maria Corina Machado, who indeed carried out the presentation, offering her medal as the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. A few hours later, the Norwegian authorities, the ones responsible for selecting and awarding this prize, published a statement on their website reminding everyone that despite the handover of the medal, the Nobel Prize has only one winner, and that recognition is for life. In any case, the authorities of the Nobel Peace Prize in Norway acted in a most unworthy manner. Here are a few more points about this. This is the only image released by these people. If you'll follow me, now then, pay attention to this image. Juan Antonio, Trump with the Nobel Peace Prize handed to him by Maria Corina Machado, no less. However, a few hours later, Trump responded in an impromptu interview with the following remarks about Maria Corina Machado and the possibility that she might begin a new era, a new phase, a new government, that she might start the presidency of a new government in Venezuela. This Trump over here. No, not this one, not this one, not this one. Well, that got lost somewhere around here. Now we're going to show it. Speaking of this, the memes about the topic. This is another one of the images or videos shared around here about what supposedly happened right after this photo was taken at the White House. Pay attention to this. There's the handoff, and suddenly the AIS guys arresting Maria Corina and Trump happy with his prize. Juan Antonio, what's the current situation in Venezuela?
Juan Antonio, ¿cuál es la situación actual en Venezuela?
Vamos a ver, mira, primero voy a comentar un poco esto porque tiene más.
Let's see. First, I'm going to comment on this a bit because there's more to it than it seems. This is very sad. First, the devilish look on this lady's face. To hand your Nobel Peace Prize to a guy who in 1 year, not even counting his first term, has bombed, attacked, and carried out military aggression against 6 countries. He's willing to invade Danish territory. He's willing to attack Iran again. I mean, giving the Nobel Peace Prize to someone who wants to increase the military budget by 50%, who has changed the name of the Department of Defense to the Department of War, and you're going to give him the Nobel Peace Prize. Could you sink any lower, Ms. Maria Corina Machado?
¿Se puede caer más bajo, señora Corina Machado?
And someone bombing their country? Someone bombing their own country?
Sí, o sea, no, que lo ha pedido ella. ¿Se puede caer más bajo?
No, she's the one who asked for it. Can you sink any lower? Now, with Maria Corina Machado, you can expect anything. Honestly, whatever she does has no value at all. None whatsoever. She's an unbearable, despicable figure. But tell me, what about a president, the president of the world's greatest power, who accepts that gift? It's like, I don't know. If the soccer team that won the Copa de las Americas came to me and said, no, you deserve it, here, I'm giving you the cup. If I don't play soccer, if I haven't done anything, I don't know. Or, I don't know if they came to you, Ezequiel, and said, here, the Nobel Prize in Physics. I'm sharing it with you, Ezequiel, the Nobel Prize in Physics.
Lo comparto contigo, Ezequiel, el premio Nobel de Física o de Medicina.
Or in medicine. Or a Hollywood Oscar. Best Director. But come on, a minimum of decency. A minimum of decency. It would make me say, no, look, I don't deserve that award. If you want to give me the little medal, fine, I'll put it on my shelf and leave it there. That's where it stays. In fact, I shouldn't accept it. It's yours. You're the one who deserves it. How can a president be so out of his mind, so deranged as to accept that? And what about the Norwegian Academy? How can they allow this? This is enough to tell Mrs. Maria Corina Machado, look, we're taking the award away from you. You don't deserve it. We made a mistake. You don't deserve it. I know she's not going to give us back the $1 million.
Ya sé que no va a devolvernos el $1.000.000. Porque imagino que el $1.000.000 tampoco se lo ha regalado a Trump, ¿eh? Esa se lo ha quedado.
Because I imagine the $1 million wasn't given to Trump either. Maria Corina kept that for herself. I know that's not the case, but look, it's over. You're not going to be listed as someone who deserved the Nobel Peace Prize. But I'll go further. Maybe some other living Nobel laureate, some other living Nobel Peace Prize winner, should also have a bit of decency and tell the Norwegian community, if this is what you've turned the Nobel Peace Prize into, I'm going to put mine in a box with horse manure and send it to Norway so you can stick it where it belongs. Because that's what you've turned the Peace Prize into. Horse manure, guano. So, I mean, it's all really disgusting, honestly.
Así que, es decir, todo es muy repugnante, de verdad. Es decir, que lo que estamos viviendo en los últimos años.
That is to say, what we've been living through in recent years, but especially in the past few months, is something truly repugnant. The level of indignity, indecency, infamy surpasses everything. I don't know. Let's see, I was much younger once, Ezequiel, and I don't remember anything like this. I'm older now, and I don't recall such levels, not even when the world was divided into blocks. I don't remember this degree of indignity. Everything is cunningly rotten. It doesn't surprise me when we say that the highest stage of the West is crime. Crime in every sense, not only the crime of killing, of murdering people, of stealing, of plundering, of looting, of distorting, of poisoning, of stripping value from everything we once thought had it. Hey, let them applaud. Let people keep applauding the Peace Prize. It's very nice. Very nice. He's already got it, as far as I'm concerned. He's going to put it there somewhere in a hallway of the White House. He'll place it there. When he stops being president, he'll take it to Mar-a-Lago. And hey, so his friend Epstein's buddy can enjoy it. Whoever goes to visit him there, at his house. Because he's Epstein's friend, let's not forget that. People here tend to forget it a lot. And since he keeps us jumping from one shock to another all day long, we end up forgetting things. He's Epstein's friend.
Let's make this clear. Here it is, finally. Trump's words about Delcy Rodriguez after the meeting. The indignant reporter asks the following question. Why don't you give the power of Venezuela to Maria Corina Machado, who has the support of the Venezuelan people, and instead you give it to Delcy Rodriguez? And Trump responds.
Remember a place called Iraq where everybody...
Well, remember a place called Iraq, where we removed everyone. Everyone was thrown out, all the government officials.
Everybody was fired, and they ended up being ISIS.
We kicked everyone out. The police, the armed forces, the generals, and they eventually ended up becoming the Islamic State. Instead of helping us with reconstruction, they turned into the Islamic State. Even so, I met someone for whom I have a lot of respect, and she obviously has a lot of respect for me.
And she gave me her Nobel Prize, but I'll tell you what,
And he gave me his Nobel Prize.
And I was very, very impressed. She's a really...
It was the first time I met her, and I was very impressed. Well, very impressed, but not enough to support her appointment as president.
This is another exercise in damage control and narrative shifting. Let's see. What was the strategic objective? Of course, we don't know, because we don't have the operations plan. What was the strategic objective of the intervention in Venezuela? One might wonder, what was it? To kidnap President Maduro? Was that the strategic objective? I mean, you move the whole fleet, 40,000 troops, dedicate yourself to hijacking oil tankers, killing people in little boats, as if those little boats could make it from Venezuela to Florida. To carry 2 kilos of cocaine, I don't know. Where would those little boats even store the fuel tanks for such a long trip? But anyway, we overlook all that. Nonsense, trivialities from people who show up on alternative channels and get paid by the Kremlin. Nonsense. What was the goal? The goal was to kidnap Maduro, that's it, and take him to the United States, a hot potato you'd have to deal with in the coming months when you're facing elections in 10. That was the goal. Or was the goal regime change and you failed? And since you failed, you have to change the narrative, damage control and narrative shift. So now it turns out Delcy is a wonderful person. Delcy Rodriguez is a wonderful person who is collaborating and, well, magnificent. And Maria Corina Machado is also a wonderful person, but she doesn't have popular support, even though they said she had won the elections with 87%. She doesn't have popular support. And of course, how are we, after that attack, going to do what was done in Iraq? That's the change in narrative. No way. We can't remove the officials or the army or the police or the bureaucratic structure of the Bolivarian Revolution. Well, of course, then what happened in Iraq won't happen. That is, we leave the entire Chavista state structure intact, and the only thing we've done is kidnap Maduro, which becomes a problem. And it's going to become a problem in the coming months. That's the strategic goal. That's the victory that's been achieved. Because as of today, the facts are what they are. The entire structure of the Bolivarian Revolution remains intact there. No one has been replaced. Diosdado Cabello is still in Interior. Vladimir Padrino is still the Minister of Defense. In command of the armed forces, Jorge Rodriguez is still the President of the National Assembly, of Parliament. So then, oh no, now we control the oil. Why do you control the oil? In fact, if you do control it, why keep hijacking oil tankers? Well, you don't actually control it. Why do you keep hijacking oil tankers? Oh no.
But
the big American oil companies are going to come in, and we're giving them another spot. Right? But you already had that. In 2023, Nicolás Maduro offered it to you. In 2023, Nicolás Maduro offered it to the Biden administration. But besides, all those companies were already there. Why did they leave Venezuela? They didn't leave of their own free will. They left because Trump, during his first term, forced them out with sanctions. So, if you already had the chance to have American companies there extracting Venezuelan oil, if you already had pretty much, because the refineries capable of processing that oil were only on the U.S. southern coast. I mean, who else was going to refine it? Brazil doesn't have those refineries, nor Honduras, nor Chile. So who's going to refine it?
The
United States. That's why Maduro is offering it. So, no, but wait. Look, we've already agreed that we're going to receive about 50 million barrels of Venezuelan oil. Yes, through Chevron, you already had that 150,000 barrels a day, but that's been going on for quite some time. So, what was the goal of the military operation? Aside from causing 100 deaths, which the U.S. administration is remarkably good at, killing people. What was the goal? Because if the goal was regime change, if the goal was to bring down the Bolivarian Revolution, well, that goal hasn't been achieved to this day, and everything else was already in place. The remaining hypothesis is that it was all an organized plan, even accepted by Maduro himself. Right?
Aceptado incluso por el propio Maduro, ¿no? Como hay hipótesis al respecto, ¿no? Hay gente que lo sostiene, ¿no?
Since there are hypotheses about it, right? There are people who believe that, right? That is, that in a plan accepted by Maduro himself, he would have a way out and a kind of political transition, negotiation, and so on, could begin with the remaining Bolivarian government, right? I'm not disputing that, but I have no proof, no evidence that this is the case. Because, of course, one wonders, what's really behind it? What is there? A political transition, some elections. But does anyone really think that after a military attack, with all the pain it has caused, with the cohesion it has generated within Venezuelan society, coming together in the face of the aggression suffered, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela would lose the elections?
Las elecciones las va a perder el Partido Socialista Unificado de Venezuela. Pero alguien de verdad ha pensado eso.
But has anyone really thought that? Has anyone thought that Maria Corina, after calling for the bombing of her own country and disgracefully, with bomb-proof indignity, handing over her Nobel Prize to Trump, the one who bombed Venezuela, is going to win an election? Honestly, there are steps I just can't understand, and beyond geopolitical, political, and economic analysis, what's needed is psychiatric analysis. You need psychiatry to make sense of all this, because it escapes me. It really escapes me. The only thing I can understand is that the narrative has now changed. Of course, no one talks about drug trafficking or any of that anymore. The narrative has been changed to hide to conceal what so far is a tactical victory and a strategic defeat. I'll say it again. If you launch a military campaign, in this case against Venezuela, with a strategic objective and that objective is not achieved, the campaign is a failure. And as of today, I don't know what will happen tomorrow. As of today, what we have is a complete failure. In fact, Delcy Rodriguez said yesterday before the Venezuelan Assembly that Venezuela had every right in the world to continue maintaining trade relations with any country in the world, including, and she named them, China, Russia, Iran, and so on. I don't know what will happen in the coming months, but for now, it certainly seems to me that they've put on a show to cover up what has been a strategic failure.
Before we wrap up, Demolishers, remember that what we can't show on this channel, we present on Patreon, on our newly launched Patreon channel, which already has around 1,200 subscribers in just a few days. Here are the 3 episodes we've done so far. The first, about the interview with Karaganov on Russian nuclear doctrine and the need to lower Russia's nuclear threshold. The second, about Zionism. And the third, about German historical responsibility. All of them with Fernando Moragon. Those are unmissable topics. With that kind of analysis, we can't present it here because of censorship, which is why we're inviting all of you to join us over there. Juan Antonio will probably also take part soon in some reaction on our Patreon channel. And with that said, Juan Antonio, one last very brief one about something important. In a way, going back to the beginning of the talk, to your initial analysis, these are Trump's words from 2 days ago. Pay attention here to the New York Times, only recorded in his voice, in his own words. The question from the New York Times journalist, Mr. President, do you see any kind of limitation to your power on the world stage?
Is there anything that could stop you if you wanted?
Could anyone stop him if they wanted to?
My own morality.
Yes, only one thing can stop me, my own morals. That is, strictly speaking, the only thing that can hold me back. And then another journalist steps in. Can't international law stop you either? I don't need international law because I don't want to hurt anyone. Well, so far, quite a few people have already been hurt. Later, in an interview with Reuters, these statements are from the original Reuters piece, 5 takeaways from President Trump's interview. Managing expectations halfway. Well, Trump's exact words. The president expressed his frustration over the fact that his Republican Party could lose control of the House of Representatives or the Senate in this year's midterm elections, citing historical trends in which the party in power has lost seats in the second year of a presidency. It's something, and now quoting directly, very psychological. When you win the presidency, you don't win the midterm elections, said Trump. He boasted of having achieved so much that, thinking about it, we shouldn't even have elections. This, by the way, triggered reactions all over the United States, including questions to Caroline Leavitt, the White House spokesperson, about the meaning of those words. She replied, "Oh, he was just making a joke." And once again, the journalists reacted. A joke about suspending elections.
Well, apparently, Mrs. Leavitt is being very unpleasant.
Yes. That's her role too, right? But specifically, here Trump was responding to an American citizen, well, there, precisely covered up by Trump's little words, a Ford worker, if I remember correctly, in Detroit, who shouted from below, "Protector of pedophiles." And President Trump responded with a thumbs up and the shout, "Fuck you," right? To an American citizen like that, out of control. I mean, completely out of control. Juan Antonio, what are the ways out of this?
No, when he says that the only limit is his morality, well, it's the morality of Einstein's friend. Everyone can draw their own conclusions.
But then, Juan Antonio, what's the way out of this?
Si él pudiera, no haría elecciones, porque las va a llevar mal, ¿eh?
If he could, he wouldn't hold elections because it's going to go badly for him. If he could, he wouldn't hold elections. Well, he's an egomaniac, a person with narcissistic personality disorder, according to a group of psychiatrists from the American Psychiatric Association. And I don't know what solution there could be because I don't see how, in a normal way, this guy could be stopped. He's got power in his hands. He's got the nuclear button. He's got money in abundance, not just his own. On top of that, he keeps making more and more money, the money of all those gangs of oligarchs around him who have names and surnames. The Western press seems to forget about these oligarchs. Anyway, they're such wonderful people, as kind-hearted as Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, George Soros, Peter Thiel. Anyway, here's the whole list of the usual suspects. Many of them will show up at the Davos Forum this month. Trump himself is going to the Davos Forum. Over there, he would have caused a scandal. And indeed, well, what can we say? This guy, if it's necessary for the elections, will end up making a public statement claiming he's spoken with extraterrestrials. Don't have any doubt about it. Whatever it takes, he'll put on a show, he'll lie. Basically, that's what he does all day. Lie, lie, lie. I don't know. I think deep down, he's not doing any good for a United States that should be figuring out how to adapt to a world that's being reshaped.
A un mundo que va reconfigurándose. Creo que está haciendo un profundo daño porque o va a llevar.
I think he's doing profound damage because it's either going to lead to a world war or to the collapse of the American system itself. No international law, nothing. If they don't allow elections, if they make a mockery of the U.S. Constitution, I think in the end it will harm everyone, including Americans themselves. And how to stop him? Well, let's see. I don't think anyone wants us to end up in a world war that would escalate to nuclear. Therefore, it's in the hands of the Americans themselves to put an end to this situation. They're the only ones who can do it right now.
Juan Antonio, como siempre un placer. Mil gracias.
Juan Antonio, as always, a pleasure. 1,000 thanks for the conversation. On Monday, your show on demolishing myths, right? Your solo show. Everyone, don't miss the chance to watch Juan Antonio's show on Mondays at 9 at night. Until then, Demolishers, thank you very much for joining us. We'll be here tomorrow. Tomorrow it's just me, and on Sunday with Fernando Moragon, as every Sunday. Demolishers, Juan Antonio, a hug.
Demoledores y demoledoras, Juan Antonio, un abrazo, chau, chau.
Bye-bye. Greetings to everyone. Goodbye.